All right, so it's a pleasure to welcome Sally Duxfield to the podcast. She's the founder, director, and owner of SallyDuxfield.com, as well as the founder of Makahika Outdoor Pursuit Centre. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful to have you on. And I know we were talking before we started recording about the location that you are, and I understand it's a really beautiful place. So I'm really keen to find out what you're doing at the Pursuit Centre and just some of the activities that you're helping people with, getting out of the city and connecting back with nature. But before we dive into that and other things you're doing today, I always like to find out about people's backgrounds and their histories. So in your case, could you start by telling us a little bit about where you're from?
Sure, Steve. Really, I had a privileged childhood. I was brought up in Auckland. My father was a die maker and tool maker in the plastics industry and owned his own business. My mother was a stay-at-home mother, so I had that very best of both worlds. Dad was a really strong engineer, so I worked on cars, I built swimming pools, I was a very practical girl, and he did a lot of time. We went hunting and we were in the outdoors. I had horses and I played sports. So I was in that environment where there was little conflict. I was really well nurtured. There was rights and wrongs. And so when I reflect back on my childhood, I feel it was a privileged childhood, not monetarily, but just it was safe and inspiring. And it gave me a whole bunch of skills. And so that led me into
And just sorry on that, it sounds like it was quite a creative environment then, if your father was building, presses and doing different things, that's quite a creative outlet, isn't it?
It is. And my brother didn't participate in that particularly. He was more the indoor lad and he played tennis and things like that. But I was the one that worked with Dad to design. And if we designed something, we built it. So
Right.
yeah, that was great.
Right. So I guess it was the practical side of things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. What had led your father to do that as a career, do you think? Do you know?
I just think he was a man that loved to work with his hands, and he's got one of those incredible, even now in his 80s, he's got an incredible brain that can solve problems and it almost sees three-dimensionally. So it was no academic background. I think he started work at 14, but it was what he could do with his hands, and just a clever man.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. And what did that lead to in your sort of high school years? Were there areas that you were more interested in than others?
I was a sportswoman, so I ended up in the high performance area of New Zealand hockey as a goalkeeper. Actually, I was this little tiny, fiery, determined 5'3",
right,
highly aggressive goalkeeper that kept getting sent off the field. But then that led me into from schooling to go into the military. I think it was that outdoor piece and really wanting to do something that was challenging.
right. And was there, because sometimes I talk with people and it's kind of in their family, like my uncle was in it or other people. Were there models for you to say this is an option, or was it just this is what I'm going to do?
My granddad he was actually in the Indian Army, he's British, and he served in the Indian Army. And so there was some history of that. And he came out to New Zealand, he retired in New Zealand, which is when my mother obviously came through. And I knew him when I was a young woman, and there was just something, a natural mana about him and this deep, deep nurture. So when he left the military, he came to New Zealand, retired, and then actually started going, when he was in Auckland, he would go to Mount Eden prison on a Friday and pick up in his little Hillman Imp men that were getting released from prison that had been there for a couple of months but had no families to go to. And so he would take these young men, primarily young Māori men, and take them home, and then he would teach them social etiquette and manners and how to grow vegetables, and he would give them a suit so that they could go for interviews. And he had this strong, very, very strong man, and very disciplined man, but this deep, deep nurture. And so, it's quite funny if I reflect back now, I'm doing some of the similar things from my granddad.
Yeah. And you got to know him quite well?
I did. Unfortunately, he passed away. In fact, one of his clients, when he was, I say clients, one of the men he was looking after, they had an argument, and he was punched and he fell over and passed away. So he was actually killed by one of the young men he was helping.
Wow.
Uh, so I lost him when I think I was probably 11 or 12.
Wow. So just, I always love to hear about people like that who, you know, in a way sacrifice something of their own comfort and their own life to reach out to others. What else are your memories? Because 11, 12, you're kind of old enough, aren't you? But you're still quite young. What other impressions do you have or memories do you have of him?
I remember his great gentleness with animals. I remember him growing half an acre of vegetables and always tending. I also knew he was, or felt that he was, the overarching umbrella for our family. You know, he was the, he did protect and he did provide. So
Mm,
it was a stereotypical role, masculine role, but a great gentleness to it as well.
yeah. Well, it's amazing to think of the legacy that he, even though you were quite young, clearly he had a big impression. It's actually something on the podcast that comes up quite often, the intergenerational relationships and how important the grandparents and the grandchildren are. There's something unique about that relationship that for unfortunately, I don't think many grandparents necessarily realize how much impact they're having on these young children who are watching and observing and learning life lessons, right?
I think it's really, really important. And it's something, Steve, that when I did a lot of work with long-term unemployed,
Yeah.
and I would say to them, you need to go and find your grandparents and discuss the world with them, because grandparents have this amazing place in our hearts, and that they're not our parents, so we don't challenge them. They did really naughty stuff that we think is you know, and well, my dad did naughty stuff. He used to blow up letterboxes and things like that as a young man. So he was a scallywag. There will be grandparents out there that grandmothers who had an illegitimate child that was never discussed with their daughter, but they might discuss it with their granddaughter to teach a lesson. So
Right.
I think that intergenerational learning is extraordinary, and it's part of what we're missing in our community.
Yeah. Particularly where people often move towns or move cities. And then I guess with technology, it's easier, but it's just not the same, is it?
Yeah.
My wife's uncle did an amazing thing. He took his grandson to Europe for like a 2-week trip, and the grandson was maybe 11 or 12, and can you imagine the memories that are formed there by going I think he was in his 60s with his grandson. And so now they've got this amazing bond because I think they went to Egypt or some random places, that's like, but through that 2 weeks, able to input into this young person. And
Yeah.
yeah, unfortunately, I don't
Extraordinary
think we do that
experience.
enough. Yeah,
Yeah, fantastic.
yeah. So what happened next? You joined the military. How was that?
I joined initially the Army Aviation Unit with the helicopters. So that was just excitement. I love helicopters.
Right.
I love boys. Boys are great. So, you know, in the military, in those days, in the early 80s, there's lots of boys. And it was just an outdoor adventure. And it had a sense of service. So it was always to serve. We were always doing something that contributed to. So there's always a purpose. And I think that was the biggest thing for me. The life learning was that when you wake up in the morning, there's not a lot of purpose of getting up and doing something unless there's a purpose behind that. And so the military for me was adventure. It was a camaraderie. I dropped out of the high performance sports, so I'd lost my sports team, that close relationship you have in that high performance sports world.
Mm,
And it ticked off all those boxes. So
mm,
there was travel, there was interesting people, there was danger, there was excitement, there was challenge, but we served down. So as an officer, your sole purpose is to serve the men and women below you. And that really then took what I learned from Granddad through to an operational business environment. And then when I left the military in my late 20s, early 30s, probably actually mid 30s, I left the military. And that was then, that stage was the realization that was in business, what I thought was missing in the corporate world was that real passion for serving down. What I saw in the corporate world was people serving up so that they could get accolades, so they could get promotions, so they could get more money, and they could have the holiday home and the boat, etc., etc.
mm,
But the thought of not getting a promotion because you stood up for the men and women below you, because you annoyed somebody above you,
Right.
didn't seem to be out there in that. And, in the military, there's a lot of people that you don't keep advancing. You just get to a set level and you can be extraordinary and stay there. And that's really encouraged, so that people aren't always climbing over the top of each other.
Yeah.
So I think that's that service down, and that's what I wanted to take from the military, and the strong psychology of leading men and women in adverse conditions. I wanted to take that into the business world.
So just break down that psychology for a moment, because I love that idea that you're looking after the people who you're leading. Have you reflected on the I guess the need for that, or the origins of that within the military context? I can immediately think of some reasons why that's really important, in terms of the danger that you're leading people into if there was a battlefield or something. But what's the origin of it, do you think?
Well, it's quite interesting that different countries have led and trained their military differently. And New Zealand has been very, very clever over probably the last 40 years in leadership within the military, understanding neuroscience, understanding the psychology of inspiring in really difficult circumstances. Because when you think about it, we pay not particularly well men and women to do particularly dangerous jobs in dangerous environments, but we want them to perform. And you can't do that. You can't get people to perform in dangerous environments by giving them more money. It doesn't work. You have to have their heart, and you have to be able to inspire and pull up. Strength is that thing that you can push down with, or you can pull up with. It's the choice that you make. And so for understanding when you carry out certain nurturing acts, the body chemicals that have been made, the oxytocin, the dopamine, those things that you make, so that there's a strong tie between the psychology and the neuroscience of leadership. And the New Zealand military particularly have done that well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think for people who've been through the military and have had those relationships that are so close and you're looking after each other, it must be quite a huge shock to come out from that into the more corporate world that you've described, where it is a bit of dog eat dog, I'm getting to the top, I've got to, rather than the camaraderie of we're in it together, we have a greater purpose. And yet ultimately, I agree with you, usually it doesn't come back to how much your salary is. Usually it's, why am I doing this? I need some reason. You're going to pay me an extra $3,000 a year. Well, that's not my motivation. Yeah. Interesting. And how did you find the transition out from the military and that sort of way of being into that world?
Well, I went straight out of the military into motherhood, and we were on a diplomatic post. So we spent sort of 5 years overseas. And so I dropped quickly into that role of being a mum to my first baby when I was in my mid-30s. And then obviously started really going, there's got to be, that wasn't my purpose. And despite, I adore my daughter, fantastic, but she wasn't the driver for my world. And I came back into New Zealand, started a consultancy, a leadership consultancy, because I wanted to come back and start building teams.
Where had you been in that diplomatic post? Which country were you?
We were just in Canberra, but we did a lot around the world travel during that time. But we were based in Australia, so it wasn't a great European trip or anything like that. So I think it was the coming back to the business world and going, what does I want to do? And it was really, the tagline became creating experiences to inspire. Because what I found was that you could teach all you want in the classroom, and I could see somebody 2 years later or 6 months later, and they'd go, didn't remember what and so there was this tie-up between, well, I learned everything in the military and I retained it. What wasn't, and obviously it's the old Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, where within 6 days you've actually lost 90% of what you learned in a classroom environment after just 6 days. That drops to something like 3 to 4% after 10 days. So from a corporate point of view, return on investment sucks. It's really, really, training is a really, really terrible waste of money.
Mm.
and as our conferences and all that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was then, how am I going to get people to create memories? Because we know with a memory, when we want to pull through learning, if we've got a memory attached to it, the brain's like a filofax, and it goes, oh, I know where that information is, and it pulls forward that memory and goes, when I was sitting on that mountaintop,
Right.
having a brew with so-and-so, I remember what I was taught about neuroscience. I remember what I was taught. So then it became, how do I create an experiential learning environment and use the outdoors as the conduit? And so
Right.
that's the whole, I'll buy an outdoor centre. And John was in England, my husband. He's a military pilot of 35 years, he served.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in England at the time. And the centre came up, and a friend of ours saw it, brought us up here, and we bought it with them. We came into a partnership for the first 2 years, and then we bought them out. And so I rang John in England and said, hey, honey, congratulations, we've just bought an outdoor centre. He's like, okay. And
Wow.
I think last time he was in Afghanistan, I bought a Prado. So I'm just escalating. He
Right.
hasn't been away since.
What's going to happen next, right?
Yeah, no, he stays. He's retired and doesn't go anywhere, just in case.
Right. Yeah, you got to watch out. So it was already an outdoor pursuit center, or what had it been before?
Yeah,
The
Makahika
origin?
was. It was originally owned by the government, actually. Sir Edmund Hillary opened it. It was the Aotearoa OPC.
Okay.
And it was set up as a bicultural centre for disadvantaged youth. Prior to that, Corrections had owned it and used it to house young men that were too young to go to jail. And so they planted all the forestry and lived out here. So it's got this, the land itself has a real connection with youth.
Mm.
And we have, it's wonderful to be able to pull that thread through and still be working with youth. We have 3,000 children a year come through the centre.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah,
And
so
maybe, yeah, why don't we turn our focus to the center itself, and we can talk about other things as we do that. But can you just describe where it is? Before we started recording, you told me, but I'm sure listeners will be interested.
we're 90 minutes north of Wellington, 45 minutes south of Palmerston North, tucked in the base of the Tararua Mountain. So it's great because we've got 2 airports close for our corporate groups that want to come in.
Mm-hmm.
I've just put in a helicopter LZ, so you can come in by helicopter as well.
All right.
So the centre itself, there's 2 parts of the property. We live on site, so we've got 2 homes on site. We only live in one. Our family or staff live in the other one, or my team live in the other one. The centre itself has high rope, zip lines. We have school clients Monday to Friday, term 1, term 4. Unfortunately, with COVID this year, we're down a quarter of our annual turnover. We lost 8 weeks of camps with children. So we've got 700 children waiting to try and fit into the end of the year.
Right.
But the property's got a river running through it. It's a natural bowl. There's forestry on one side, Douglas firs. There's native bush areas. There's a 46 bunk lodge. And so we set up a big tented camp, which houses another 60. So we have these sort of 3 groups. One group, it might split into 3. And they rotate around. They do the adventure training, they do survival training, they do hiking, map and navigation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really for youth, for youngsters, it's about consequence of action. And it's about getting them off the blue light. So getting them out and off computers. Because once again, that's my strong bias to neuroscience, is that I want children, I want to drop cortisol levels, I want to drop dopamine levels. Our big issue, and here's a rabbit hole, I'll pop down a rabbit hole. Our big issue with digital overload is the high levels of dopamine. So dopamine's our happy drug, and every time you get you kill a troll on some planet off site that you do, that game that you're playing, you get dopamine, and it's more addictive than alcohol and nicotine. So the problem with that is it also inhibits melatonin, which is our sleep drug. So you've got teenagers completely, and young kids completely and utterly stoned off their brains on dopamine. And so we're coming into our evenings, and when we're meant to be easing down and being full of serotonin because we've ticked off our checklist and we've had this amazing day and we feel satisfied and we've had a beautiful meal and we've shared with our family, dim lights, melatonin, sleep. Well, these kids and teenagers aren't doing that. They are up at 2 and 3 in the morning because they can't sleep. The detriment of that, of course, is that there's huge degradation of your cognitive skills because you're sleep deprived. But more importantly, importantly, is the fact that anxiety is the outcome of sleep deprivation. So now you're not sleeping, so you're getting upset and you're getting angry. So you're making cortisol, high levels of cortisol, stress, and then anxiety drops out of that. So it's a real issue for our youth. So the camp's brilliant because we have 5 days where the children have no blue lights. And so their behavior by Friday is completely different from the children that came in the front end. And so that's the camp. That's that camp side of it. Yeah. And then we've built a
so just can I ask a question there? We'll continue on, but I'm just curious. You've mentioned quite a few times like the experience or the experiential part of this, and that's how you create memories. And I agree with you. But I'm just curious from your perspective. I love the word curating. You curate an experience. How do you do that well for people so that they have experiences that they remember? What's your thought process of designing something, even if it was an overnight experience for people? Or what's the secret sauce to make a good experience that people will take with them and reflect back on?
Of course, I can't give you all of my secrets, Steve. Otherwise,
oh no.
You're absolutely right. There is a magic and there is a strong psychology to building an experience that allows people to finish the experience and go, that was amazing. I would do that again. And so it's a bell curve, basically. Children or adults coming in must come into our environment where very quickly they build trust. So those activities up front are quite what I call fragile activities. So they're not big, hairy ass ones. They're the ones where they'll learn about, they might be doing some adventure-based learning. They might be doing some team building activities where they're just getting to know the instructors, the environment, that their food is coming on time, something really primal, like a consistency of high quality food. And the child goes, oh, I'm safe now, I don't need to worry about that. And then we build into activities where they might use a harness on a lower activity so that when we get to the high ropes, they've built that level of trust. And it's exactly the same with the corporates. When our corporates come in, depending on what we want to do, because we could do the opposite. If my job was to be a disruptor and cause conflict so that we could very quickly look under your skirt, which we do with some clients because that's what they want.
Yeah.
But if we're building trust and high performance, then we will bring in a corporate. We will have a program that leads us to have some sharing. We don't go deep into vulnerability at the beginning because no one wants to do that without building that sense of team and who we are and trust. And then slowly you just add and then you squeeze. It's like a piano accordion. You squeeze and then you relax completely and make people safe. And then you pull out the learning. And it's really important to go, what did that feel like? And New Zealanders, we get this little bit of sack in the front of our mouth when we go, what did that feel like? And they go, oh, I don't want to discuss with you. And so you've got to pull that learning out. And then you've got to find out what worked for them, what didn't work for them, so what they do more of, what they do less of. And then we get the piano accordion out again and we squeeze it harder and we tighten pressure. And that person can then recall and go, that's right, that worked for me, bring it on. And so over 2 or 3 days, we can take a really dysfunctional team and pull them together in this really strong team that know each other's strengths. Understand that a weakness is just an opportunity for somebody to lean into that space. And then, of course, the campfire. The psychology of the campfire is just extraordinary. And then you sit in that deeply reflective space and it's extraordinary what comes out.
So what do you mean by the psychology of the campfire? I can guess, but if you can explain, that would be great. So
campfires do something really primal to us. And it doesn't matter what we do, the primal part of our brain is really, it releases cortisol in the morning when we, get up. We're looking for Neanderthals or dinosaurs. So there's this part of our brain that when we sit around a fire or we cut firewood or we whittle around a fire, we're not looking at faces because we can't see faces. We can see this far. So all of a sudden we're actually sitting as a team, but individually, because I'm not looking you in the eye.
Mm-hmm.
And this sense of storytelling comes over, and there's a lovely saying that light a fire and every man becomes a storyteller.
Mm.
And so what happens is that the days, and the history of the fire was it kept us warm at night, but hunters and gatherers went out during the day as individuals. So I went off and got the saber tooth, and you went off and did this, and so did that. And when we come to the fire, we've actually, and you and I might have had a fight out there over my saber tooth was bigger than yours. When we come to the fire, all of that from the day is forgiven, and we reform, and we reset. And so to be excluded from a fireplace was to be excluded from warmth and food and companionship or camaraderie. So when we sit as a team, all of a sudden we're not in the office. We don't have a title or a rank, and we might have had a fight in the morning or a really strong disagreement about something, but that fireplace pulls that back in, and we reset, and then we learn lessons, and then the next day we hop up and boom, we're high performing again. So it's a really, really deep reflective tool to use, an actual fireplace with that smell of wood smoke and that crackle, preferably with some glowworms in a river, and then Bob's your uncle. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Those are the right ingredients, aren't they? And
Yes.
I like that, because I think you're right. For all of us sitting in a office boardroom, wearing formal clothing, maybe a suit and tie, and having a whiteboard, like that's one type of way to reflect or to get to know each other or to connect. But it's a very different one to having, gone on a hike or done an activity, crossing a river or whatever, and then to come together around a campfire. It's a completely different dynamic, isn't it?
It is, and you don't have to do highly physical things either. So that we've actually just released a Campfire program right now for the environment that we're in, where we've been highly isolated, huge amount of digital, Zooming, everybody's Zooming. So we've just released a sort of a half day, one night, corporate activity where you come in, and really all we're doing in the afternoon is we're gathering firewood, we're cutting kindling, we're looking at personality types. So we're understanding those people that loved isolation. When you think of the introverts that have just thought that being at home for this last 8 weeks has been the best thing in their entire world because they didn't have to talk to anybody. And the extroverts that have been standing out at the letterbox waving to complete strangers because they're like, I've lost all my friends. So we'll just spend some time talking about the introversion, extroversion, the personality types. We'll talk a little bit about Maslow, the old hierarchy of needs. So my strong belief, if it affects your business, then it is your business. So I have this deep, deep passion that if something's going on in your home, Steve, and it affects your performance in my office, then it's a leadership issue. It's not a management issue, but it's a leadership issue. So we'll just very softly do some things in an afternoon, gather some kindling, some firewood, get ready to cook a meal. Some people will go into that, barbecuing and roasting those potatoes on the fire. We've got some pen knives, and people are sitting around the fireplace just whittling and just chewing the cud, talking. I've got some little plaiting going there. Some people are making little friendship bracelets while they're talking, because if we give the brain and the hand something to do, we're also opening up right hand, left hand side of our brain. And then we go into this very gentle evening and the fire, and we put our team back. We refit our team. We reset our team after the strong period of isolation. So yeah, it's just, you can do so much. It doesn't have to be highly physical.
Yeah.
But it's highly
interesting
emotional
as well, because even some of the things that you're talking about, it's not like an in-depth seminar with a point of PowerPoint. It's more like, hey, we're going to peel the potatoes, we're going to gather the firewood, we're going to, almost the fact that it's so basic is what brings the people together, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I always laugh that I'm shallow. I'm shallower than puddles. I am champagne and giggles girl, but I feel deeply, but I pretend I don't. I want people to not actually get too serious about this, because it will, the learning and the feelings will be very serious, but we take it from the point of view that this is actually about an experience. So this is about love and care and nurture and watching out for those micro behaviors, because you will see people that don't join in. You will see people that are still struggling, and then that opportunity occurs around the fire for somebody to very gently go, is there something that we can do to help you? Because we often don't watch micro behaviors in our teams. If you think about an office environment where one day somebody's come in and they normally shave every single day, and they're normally their shirt's ironed, but today it's not. But very few of us would actually go up and go, hey, you look like a sack of whatever, what's going on? Because it's not our business. And so it's actually the micro behaviors. Who's not eating lunch? If I said to a CEO every day, who in your leadership team ate lunch today, they'd think I was crazy. But from a military officer's point of view, every single soldier I see, I check if they're having breakfast, if they're eating lunch, because if they're not, there's two things. A, something's wrong, so that's my nurture part. But from an operational point of view, they're not going to perform.
Right.
So if you're that person who's got an engineer's brain, and I always pick on engineers who really don't care, I don't care, I just want performance, pretending to nurture actually produces the same body chemicals in your team as if you care deeply.
Right.
So if you want operational effectiveness and you want increased turnover and you want better outputs, then pretend to give a shit. You need to actually do that. And so it doesn't matter the reason for your nurture, whether it's genuine or if it's I need higher operational output, the effect is the same.
Yeah.
So to watch what I call the periphery behavior is really, really important.
Yeah. And I guess the word that I'm thinking of as you're talking is a holistic view of the person, rather than just saying, well, how many units did this person produce? How many widgets were produced by them? It's that holistic view, taking an interest in the bigger picture, which is something I think we're getting better at, but can always be improved. Can I ask a question? Just because so much of what you're doing, it feels like nature plays a really important role. Can you just describe, I guess, the role of nature in some of the things that you're doing? It feels almost like it's an actor or another part of the programs that you offer. And what do you observe with people who are coming in and standing by the river or going on a walk? And what's the role that nature plays in all that you do?
A really good question, Steve. And I'm going to call her she, is extraordinarily important in the journey. I think that connection to land, I think that connection to that trickling stream, that sound of that water, once again, it pulls through that really primal part of our body that stops us and slows us. There's a strong once again, neuroscience, a strong chemical reaction to that, really high levels of endorphin, really high levels of serotonin, that satisfaction, that softness of sitting. And I watch people sit out in nature, and in fact, often they don't even need to talk. It's just cathartic. It's just, it's not busy. She's really noisy. You go out and you think, oh, it's so quiet, but you actually listen. There's you can hear the kiraru cutting through the forest, and you can hear their wing cutting. You can hear at nighttime the ruru, and there's possums, and there's all sorts of insects. So there's this whole rhythm and sound, and I think it's really, there's a very strong spiritual aspect. Whether you're spiritual or not, there you sit, and she just envelops you, and everything seems to cut away. And I think you add that with that campfire, and all of a sudden you talked about the metaphor of the onion peeling back. We end up with all these stripped bulbs sitting around this fire, because nature's done her business. She's taken everybody apart. Great facilitation takes the next few layers off.
Yep.
And then a campfire, and we own you. It's just you can just sit and be in nature.
Mm. I
Mm.
think it's really valuable to have these conversations. And it's kind of basic in that, of course, we all connect with nature, but how often do we forget that, particularly those of us who are living in cities or urban environments, going into the office? You do start to lose that connection. There's a wonderful book, which you may or may not have read, called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek
Oh
by
no, I haven't.
someone named Annie Dillard. So I'll send you a link, or I'll put it in the show notes, actually.
Oh, great.
She won the Pulitzer Prize in America for writing this book. And it's basically, she took herself away from society for a year, and it's kind of a journal. It's basically a nonfiction journal of what she observed in nature. And she was living by a stream, and it's, in some ways it's such a basic book, but she goes for a walk, but she observes, looking at the, with eyes that are open, and observing the birds sitting in the tree, and listening to the sound of the river, and noticing the moth that's drawn to the light at her window. And it's just really beautifully done. And I think sometimes in our modern fast-paced, how many Facebook likes did I get on that latest post, we kind of forget the beauty that's around us, even in cities, in that sort of what nature can provide for us.
Mm. And that's when you listen and watch nature, you actually, it's the exact behavior I'm asking you to look for in leadership, the periphery behaviors. So it's that, and it's also a skill, a military skill, is that huge external observant. So you're in an operational environment and you're constantly looking left, right, up, down. You're not just walking along. And we actually have turned, there's an activity I call the blue bag. And what it was, we used it in the forestry, teaching some forestry guys, because forestry is really, really dangerous. And we hung this blue lunchbox on the side of a tree and walked people through the forest. And we'd walk them up this track, and you'd you'd get to the end of the track and say, did anyone see anything that shouldn't have been there? And they're like, no. And it's often take 2 or 3 times. We did this with the Black Sox pre-World Champs last year before they went to Prague, and we brought them in for 3 days. And we did it with these guys. They didn't see anything. And it wasn't until we said, actually, now when you walk through the forest, you don't just walk through a path. Listen, look, feel, observe, look at the toadstools, look at the different color of the leaves today. Look at, really, really observe your environment, because that then goes back into a high performance sports team. So when I'm in Prague and I'm at the World Champs and I notice that one of my teammates hasn't come down for breakfast, that's no different from walking through the forest and looking at toadstools. You're observing and learning to observe the periphery.
Yeah.
So nature's a great teacher of that.
Yeah, which comes back, I'm sure, to a word that you use a lot, which would be mindfulness, right? Like being aware just even of your own breath and where you are and the light. And it's something that I think in our modern day we get so distracted so easily that we don't just take that time to center down and sort of breathe deeply and appreciate what's around us.
Which is why we've actually, Steve, built this beautiful luxury village called Arete. And it's the Greek meaning of Arete versus the French meaning. And the meaning of Arete in Greek is that men and women of Arete are people of great standing and courage, and they use wit and strength and bravery to be great citizens. So Arete is this little village that is on the back of our property, and we have 8 twin share, if you want, or single occupancy whare. So they're just an 8x4 beautiful little whare that's been built with roll down plastic sides. It's all on solar, bamboo composting loos, little infinity gas, solar run showers, beautiful meandering pathways. And you go up there and you just sit and you watch corporate clients come from that bustle, and they're actually able to be mindful. They're actually able to be present, because there's no cell phone coverage. There's no landlines going. There's no computer dinging in the background. There's no one knocking at your door. And you find these executive teams come out of there completely changed within 2 or 3 days. They are different men and women because they've had time to just sit in nature. And we've got a huge stag on the back of our property, and he wanders down early or late at night and early in the morning. We've got pheasants and quail that come through, and all of a sudden you can just stop. We've got a couple of clients who work in the investment industry, and they bring in their clients from around the world, and they wanted a location where they could have these really strong, probably billion-dollar conversations. But then the Christians could go off and pray, the spiritual people would go off and do yoga, the Buddhists would go over and do their meditation in the quiet of this forest around this village, and then they'd come back and then they'd smash out another billion-dollar deal. But they all needed to reflect in their own way and be present. And so that's why we built this village, so that you come and sit and reflect deeply in a corporate environment.
Yeah, no, it's really good. The last bit of this particular rabbit hole that I'll go down is I lived for 5 years in Japan. And one of the biggest things I noticed in Japan was that they just had this appreciation for the seasons and for nature, which was absolutely, it was kind of mind-blowing in a way. Like I was only 20, 21 when I moved there, and I taught English in Osaka. And I remember the first time somebody came and said, do you want to go cherry blossom viewing? You know, and basically people go out, and we in the West, we kind of like, oh yeah, that's a pretty looking tree. You know, there's some cherry blossoms on it. But in Japan, it's actually almost a tradition. You go with your friends, your family, you take a picnic, you sit underneath the tree, you're looking up, and it's called hanami, which means look at the flowers, basically. And then in the autumn time, when the leaves are all changing like they are now to red, deep red colors and yellow, they have something called koyo, which is looking at the red leaves. And people will go on bus tours to different parts of the forest, you know, to see the beauty of nature. And it's really stuck with me, just that appreciation for nature that I think we sometimes lack in our Western fast-paced world.
I totally agree, Steve. We get really busy, don't we? And just sit. And so I guess for me, Makahika was the opportunity to bring corporates out of, and we can do this. I actually travel and deliver this experience anywhere that you want it, because there's lots of nature anywhere, and I can go and set up. I've got instructors that can go in and actually run I could go to Vancouver and fly in an instructor who'd run the national park at Vancouver, and we'd set up activities. So we can do this anywhere. You don't have to come to me, but it's just using nature as the conduit. Yeah. Because she's a leveler. Because when you're wet, cold, and hungry, you're either an extraordinary man or woman, or you're not. Yeah. And so you can't hide. You cannot hide in nature. Yeah. So it's a really, really good tool. And it's not used to destroy. I mean, you expose people really quickly in nature, but it's also a great tool for that gentleness of rebuilding. So yeah, you can do this.
I'd love to change tack slightly, just because I love what we're talking about, and it's really important, I think, to have these messages. But one of the things that strikes me is that you're dealing with a lot of high performance leaders, you know, sports teams, people coming in. And you mentioned a word before about vulnerability and sensitivity and things. I'm just wondering, in your reflecting and in your own work as well, thinking about leaders and leadership, what are some of the characteristics that you really see coming through as themes among the best leaders that are coming to participate in what you're doing, and how, and basically what can we learn from those people? What is it that makes a really good leader?
Great question. And here's a little ad for my book. My book that's coming out in August is called Soft Strength.
Okay.
So I love strength, but I love strength that's used on the light side versus the dark side. So strength pulls up, it raises up. And the best skills, or the pieces that I see of beautiful leaders that come through here, are men or women who care deeply. They are curious, they're gracious, and they're really, really self-compassionate, which is quite an interesting interesting thing is, so they are compassionate people,
Mm.
but they can only be compassionate because they're actually self-compassionate. And and her name's just gone, it'll come back to me shortly, but I was reading a book the other day, and it was about self-compassion versus self-esteem.
Right.
And it was a really interesting piece, because we've always talked about having programs and courses to build self-esteem. But of course, self-esteem is based on comparison. Self-esteem is based on if I do this, or if I love myself, I'll be good enough. So self-esteem has a strong association with, I will actually put people down or bully people so I have a higher sense of self-esteem. So I'm not good enough, so I'm hard on myself. Whereas when I have self-compassion, I go, it's okay.
Mm.
You know, in meditation in the morning, it's okay. What did I learn from that, rather than I'm a failure? And so men and women that are extraordinary leaders that have that self-strength are really self-compassionate. They realize that they're humans,
Mm.
and humans screw up regularly, and
Mm.
we cut ourselves some slack, and then we go, what will we take from that? And that's exactly the same in leadership. So when people make mistakes in leadership, it's not a time to pull out a big stick. Don't get me wrong, there's times for big sticks, but it's probably a time to sit and be curious and go, why were you in that position? Why? And if you failed, what was it I didn't provide you with, or what was going on at home that led you to a point where you were not performing well?
Mm.
So, and I was reflecting on that the other day. I led some men, this is years and years ago, in behind Coromandel in August. I'd come from Army to Air Force, and there's two different cultures there. One's a lot hairier than the other. Air Force is gentler, more gentlemanly, using some historical words. And I'd taken these men and a couple of women, there were 8 of us, tramping in the back of Coromandel, and it was wet. And Air Force don't tramp, and they don't do the bush, and they don't do muddy, they do hotels. And we were about 4 or 5 hours in, and my sergeant, who was in his 50s, and I would have been 23 or 24 as a young officer, the sergeant halfway up this hill just took off his pack, threw it in the ground and said, you can get fixed. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm like, oh, mutiny, great, first time out. And I remember my reaction, and this is what I was reflecting on the other day, is I sent the rest of the team forward with a flight sergeant, said, just, you head off up the track, I'll see you. And my instinct was not to rip this guy and go, you just embarrassed me in front of the team. Or don't speak to me like that, which is often a parent to child, don't speak to me like that.
Right.
My natural instinct was to sit behind him. I just got out a brew and I made a cup of tea. So it was a really strong nurture. You know, there's me 24, him 52, hand him a cup of tea. I didn't even need to say anything. And very quickly he came out and said, oh, I'm really sorry about my behavior. I'm just pissed off with myself because I'm not as fit as I was. I'm feeling physically really bad. I've let myself down. I've let the team down. And so he was journeying himself. So I think the skills or the things that I see in great leaders is that curiosity as to why that person's behaved like that, and that ability to be compassionate and go, well, that's okay. You know, what would we do differently next time? It's not saying that we cut people slack, because there's absolutely a time. I've got what I call my tool belt, and I've got a cloth on my tool belt, and that's for wiping the toes of my boots after it comes out of your backside. So, you know, I have no compunction at all about a time where you need to put somebody against a wall and go, that behavior is not acceptable.
Yeah.
But if you know your team really, really well, I think what I see in people is that ability to be curious and be soft.
That's really interesting. I love the word that you're using a lot, which is curious. And it's a word I actually try to model on the podcast. I'm not sure if the listeners are able to pick this up, but quite often I'll frame my questions by saying, I'm just curious, and then I'll ask the question. And my hope is that by modeling the use of that word, it will help the listeners to realize, well, I can be curious too in my own context, talking with, you know, my partner or my boss or the child down the road, whatever it is, you know, just that. I love that word, the curiosity of it. But then the thing that you're picking up is that the best leaders are self-aware enough to know that they have failings as well. And give themselves slack for that as well. Mm.
And it also means that the men and women watching you understand that you've made a mistake and you've forgiven yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so they will emulate that behavior. So when you're hard on yourself, and it's like, that historical or that old picture we had of that harsh father and the son, and nothing was ever good enough.
Yep.
And the father goes, those exam results aren't good enough. And that detriment, but of course that father is only behaving like that probably because his father behaved like that, and he hasn't got any other tools in his toolbox. And he's probably feels terrible, but that's his learned behavior. And so that's one of the other things in leadership, is to understand that people will often behave because that's the only example that they had before them. And they will have had a leader who was a bully, and I call that a manager who's a leader. Because managers, they just manage widgets and they do functional things. So I think we often have to sit and go, people behave a certain way because the only example they had and the only tool they had available was an example from a poor leader.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's so often about what you've learned behaviors and the examples, and it kind of, this is why I like the podcast, finding out a bit about your own experience and your childhood. You had some really good examples, and you mentioned you had a privileged upbringing in the sense of your father, your grandfather. Like, these were people that you could really, really learn from. But for many people, they never had that, And but I find it quite interesting. I don't know if you're observing this, but there's a lot of books coming out recently which are able to talk about this. Like, I think if we went back a decade or longer, of course, but the idea that there are soft skills, that there are words like vulnerability and sensitivity and empathy, and that these are real strengths for a leader, rather than being, well, that's just, we're not interested in that. I read Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead, which came out recently. And of course, she's all about vulnerability and, being open. And it's just fascinating that a book like that would rise to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, because if you read it, there's a lot of very soft skills, I guess you'd call it, that she's talking about as well.
Yeah, and I have a little fear within our New Zealand culture that we are a reasonably staunch culture, and we have a perception of where men sit in that. So I don't ever want to take away from that staunchness, because I love that in leadership. I love decisiveness. I love people that make decisions. I love people that drive. I love all those. I love authoritative behaviour. But that comes, there's a yin and a yang to that, and you've got to know when to flex. And so that's the thing. I'm not saying to people we should all be collaborative all the time and have lots of hugs. That's not what, because when we're out in nature, really quickly she'll change. So the weather will change, and you have to be tough, hard, make decisions. And so there's a really strong part of nature that's she's unforgiving, and leadership can be like that. It's got to be really, really decisive. But there's also when you can and when the time is appropriate, that really flip gentle side, that yang that goes, what is it that's making you bad? What can I do for you? Because remember, if somebody screws up, most of the time it's because you as a leader didn't provide them with what they needed to be successful. So the only question I think a leader needs to ask every single morning is, what do you need from me today to be successful? Do you need a hug? Do you need a kick? What do you need? So it's that ability, that agility to flex, I think is also really important.
Yeah. And I guess it comes back to something you mentioned as well, the different personality types. We're not all the same. And I've worked in enough places where I've had different bosses, and different people react in different ways. Even how you present information, some people would want it just written on a page, others would want it verbally conveyed. Let's work together and have a solution. But recognizing it, I guess, that we're all slightly different.
We ran a course, Steve, for a couple of years, my business associate and longtime friend Sally Duxfield, and we ran a program, it was called the EDGE program. It was for New Zealand Chartered Accountants, NZCA, and it was 21 accountants over 2 years, and they had 3 residentials a year at our centre and a couple of off-sites. And the most moving, so if we go stereotypical, for me, an accountant sits in sort of if we use birds, we've got the hawk and the peacock and the dove and the owl. And I'm a cross between a hawk and a peacock, so I'm a driver and I like to talk. And then you've got the owl. And for me, that deeply analytical person that loves process and figures, it's like watching white paint dry. You know, I look at them and I go, oh, I wonder what shade of white they're going to be. But what was really interesting is that the most moving thing of this 2-year program, the most moving thing was that these men, particularly the men, some of them wrote love letters on the first residential to their wives to say sorry for being so focused on their careers. They'd come out of university, they became accountants, they worked their way up through the company, they were now directors or partners or punting for that, and they had at all costs been driven on that career path of high performance within accountancy. It'll be the same in the legal area, in law, exactly that same thing. And these men sat there, we did this thing on personality, and they realized that at what cost were they actually living their life as these high-powered accountants, and so they were partners, at what cost? And so the most moving part of that 2-year program was our very first module that was about the man or woman, your legacy. Who, when I speak at your funeral next week, what will I say of you?
Yeah.
He was a great accountant, but he sucked as a father. You know what? Yeah. So what am I going to say? So I think that legacy thing is extraordinary.
No, I love it. I've loved our whole conversation because there's so many resonant points, even with my own life, you know, that having had a career focusing on things, I had to reimagine who I was about 4 years ago, basically living in Australia and Sydney, working at a big law firm, very extreme hours and things, and thinking, is this really what I want? I've done some reading on this, and you probably have as well, you know, in terms of the first half of life and the second half of life. And quite often the first half of life, people are really focused on the CV qualities, you know, like I got this degree and I achieved this, and read my CV, you want to hire me. And the second half is those eulogy qualities, you know, he was kind, he was gentle, he looked after his team, which are such, you know, such contrasts. And you don't realize that you're kind of focused on the wrong thing until you've had some life experience. And then fortunately, people listening to this podcast, hopefully, are able to then transition into that. How can I give back? What is the legacy? And so it must be fascinating to be involved with people at critical junctures in their life, you know, helping them through.
It's an extraordinary privilege.
Yeah.
And I just, it's my life, you know, and I'm just so privileged to work with, do what I love, with people I love, where I love, and it's a gift, it's a privilege. So yeah.
It's so awesome. Well, what we'll do in the show notes, we'll link to your websites of any kind. And if you've got resources and particularly information about your book that's coming out, like we can have some links or some way that people can make sure that they go on newsletters or, you know, keep up to speed. But yeah, it's been really fascinating talking with you and just hearing your own life journey and then what's led you to do what you do today. And certainly I think people listening will have gotten a lot out of it in terms of what are those skills that we need to be cultivating within ourselves. So I just want to say thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been really great.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great. Cool. So